We build our monuments to progress on foundations of sand, believing that because we have named the laws of physics, we have mastered them. We split the atom and called it energy. We harnessed the invisible fire and called it power. But there is an arrogance inherent in the human condition of fatal blindness that assumes the universe is merely a machine to be operated, rather than a veil to be lifted. When you tear apart the fabric of reality to boil water, you are not just releasing heat, you are creating a hole. And if you stare into that hole long enough, eventually, something stares back. April 1986, the Soviet Union, a colossus standing on legs of iron and clay, rotting from the inside out. While the West gorged on excess, the USSR was a machine of quotas, silence, and concrete. Yet, in the heart of Ukraine there was a jewel, Pripyat, the Atom City, a model of socialist utopia housing 50,000 souls, built to serve the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. It was a city of roses and broad avenues, where the average age was 26. Children played in the shadow of the cooling towers, and their parents slept soundly, trusting in the infallibility of the state and the thick concrete shields of the reactors. But inside the control room of Unit 4, the air was not filled with dreams, but with a toxic mixture of caffeine, stale tobacco smoke, and paralyzing anxiety. It was the early hours of April 26th. Outside, the spring night was cool and indifferent. Inside, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, was pushing a bruised and battered reactor to its breaking point. They were conducting a safety test, a simulation of a power outage, a test that had been delayed, rushed, and mishandled by a skeleton crew tied to their bones. History tells you this was a disaster of bureaucratic incompetence and design flaws. They speak of the positive void coefficient, the fatal instability of the RBMK 1000 reactor at low power. They speak of the graphite-tipped control rods. But looking back through the forensic lens of what actually occurred, we see that the machine was not just unstable, it was agitated. As the clock ticked toward 1:23 a.m., the instruments in the control room began to behave with an erratic violence that defied the laws of thermodynamics. The readouts didn't just spike, they screamed. The heavy concrete floor, feet thick, began to vibrate with a low-frequency thrum that sickened the stomach, a sound, not mechanical, but organic, like the purring of a subterranean leviathan. Akimov and Topchinov, the operators at the desk, looked at each other with eyes wide in a primal terror that transcended professional fear. They weren't afraid of losing their jobs anymore. They were afraid of the shadows lengthening in the corners of the room, shadows that did not match the light sources. Dyatlov ordered the test to continue, his voice cracking not with anger, but with a sudden, freezing realization that the heat rising from the core smelled of ozone and sulfur. In a desperate bid to kill the reaction, Akimov engaged the AZ-5 button, the emergency shutdown, the failsafe. It was meant to drop every control rod into the core and silence the atom. Instead, it acted as a key. The graphite tips entered the core, displacing the water, and for a microsecond, the reactivity didn't drop, it went infinite. The lid of the reactor, a 1,000-ton biological shield, nicknamed Alina, lifted into the air. But what erupted from that shattered silo was not merely radioactive steam. The barrier between our world and the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth had been pulverized. The dying light of the Soviet Union was extinguished, and the Hellgate was open. The explosion did not sound like a detonation. Witnesses later described it not as a roar, but as a gasped sound of the atmosphere rushing into a vacuum where the world used to be. The roof of Unit 4 was obliterated, and a column of incandescent violet light pierced the night sky, reaching 2 kilometers into the stratosphere. It was beautiful, it was hypnotic, and it was a lie. The light was not Cherenkov radiation, it was a beacon. At 1:28 a.m. the first alarm went out to the paramedical militarized fire brigade, Unit 2, led by Lieutenant Volodymyr Provik. They were told the roof was on fire. They were told it was a standard bitumen blaze. They sped toward the reactor in their ZIL-130 trucks, expecting heat and smoke. What they found was a landscape that had rejected Euclidean geometry. The asphalt around the plant wasn't melting, it was undulating. Blocks of red-hot graphite, ejected from the core, littered the ground like severed organs, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic luminosity. The firefighters deployed their hoses, the water arcs gleaming in the eerie light. But when the water hit the burning roof of the turbine hall, it didn't evaporate, it screamed. The steam rose up and took shapes, vague humanoid twisting forms that dissipated and reformed, lunging at the men. Provik and his team, trained for chemical fires and electrical hazards, stood paralyzed as the laws of nature unraveled. One of the men, Titnok, stepped forward to kick a piece of graphite off the road. The moment his boot connected, the isotope didn't just burn him, it merged with him. The horror of the Chernobyl entity was not that it killed you, but that it refused to let you die. The radiation was not merely ionizing, it was animating. Titnok fell, convulsing, his skin instantly blackening, not from char, but from the subdermal eruption of foreign biomass. He rose seconds later, his eyes boiled white, emitting a low-frequency Geiger crackle from his throat. He threw himself at his comrades, his touch transferring the gift of the open core. The Soviet tactical doctrine of 1986 relied on containment, sacrifice, and brute force. They tried to spray foam. They tried to beat back the flames with canvas coats. It was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a spoon. In Pripyat, the city slept, then woke to the metallic taste of blood and ozone. The famous Bridge of Death, overlooking the plant, filled with spectators. Families gathered on the overpass, drawn by the mesmerizing violet pillar. They believed they were watching a fire. They didn't realize they were standing in the path of the inhale. As the wind shifted, carrying the fallout toward them, the spectators didn't cough. They simply stopped moving. Hundreds of people, standing on a bridge, freezing in place as their nervous systems were hijacked by the airborne contagion. They stood like statues, facing the reactor, a silent choir witnessing the birth of a new god. General Pikolov arrived in his chemical reconnaissance vehicle, a modified BRDM-2 armored scout car, driving straight into the gates of hell to measure the radiation. The dosimeter didn't max out. It melted. Pikolov looked through the thick lead glass viewport at the ruins of Unit 4. There was no debris pile inside the crater. The reactor vessel was empty. The core hadn't just exploded, it had hatched, and whatever had been incubating inside the graphite was already moving toward the city. The panic didn't start with screams. It started with the realization that the shadows on the walls were detaching themselves and walking away. The containment zone was a fictional line drawn on a map by old men in Moscow who believed ink could stop radiation. By the morning of April 27th, the zone of alienation was not a perimeter. It was a digestion chamber. The Soviet military machine, lumbering and mighty, finally awoke. But it woke too late. The 30-kilometer radius was already lost, consumed by a rapidly expanding terraforming event that sought to remake the Earth in the image of the burning core. The initial response was aerial. A squadron of Mi-8 and Mi-24 Hind helicopters, the pride of the Soviet Air Force, was dispatched to drop bags of sand, boron, and lead into the gaping maw of the reactor. The pilots, flying heavy with radiation suits that offered as much protection as paper napkins against a supernova, approached the pillar of violet light. As Major Anatoly Grishchenko hovered his Mi-26 over the breach, the air intake filters didn't just clog with dust, they clogged with swarming, microscopic particulate matter that possessed a hive intelligence. The engines didn't stall. They began to scream with the sound of tearing metal. The helicopter didn't fall because of gravity, it was pulled down. Tendrils of superheated semi-solid ionization lashed out from the crater like the tongues of frogs, snagging the rotors. The aircraft crumpled and was dragged into the pit, adding its metal and its crew to the biomass incubating below. On the ground, the evacuation of Pripyat began, a logistical operation involving 1,200 buses. It was meant to be a temporary relocation. It became a death march. As the convoy of yellow Icarus buses lined up on Lenin Avenue, the red forest bordering the city began to change. The pine trees turned ginger, then red, then a bruised purple. The bark split open, revealing pulsing wet muscle underneath. The roots pulled themselves from the earth and began to crawl toward the road. The civilians packed into the buses watched in silence as the forest marched to intercept them. The lead vehicle struck a wall of writhing vegetation that had erupted through the asphalt. The doors welded shut. The air inside the buses turned into a microwave oven of gamma radiation. The convoy didn't turn back. It simply ceased to be a transport column and became a row of iron tombs, fused to the road. The passengers inside merged into single gelatinous masses of suffering. The Soviet army, desperate and blind, authorized the use of tactical artillery. T-72 tanks and self-propelled howitzers lined up on the outskirts of the zone, shelling the advancing horror. They fired high explosive rounds into the shifting shapes in the fog. But the enemy was not an army, it was an environment. The shock waves merely scattered the contagion faster. When the tank crews buttoned up their hatches, they sealed their own fate. The Mi-8 rapidly growing fungal radioactive hybrid began to grow over the vision blocks and into the ventilation systems. It didn't need to penetrate the armor, it just needed to block the air, inside the steel beasts. The crews suffocated, only to be reanimated hours later, driving their tanks blindly into the Dnieper River, drowning the engines and poisoning the water supply for millions downstream. Kiev was next. The wind carried the spores south. The Dnieper, the aorta of Ukraine, turned black and viscous. The fish floated to the surface, not dead, but changed, grown together in clusters of scales and teeth. The panic that hit the capital wasn't the chaotic running of a crowd. It was the psychic crushing weight of a population realizing that the sky itself was their enemy. The Communist Party officials, who had spent days denying the event, boarded planes for Moscow, leaving the city to the mercy of the fallout. But the planes didn't leave Ukrainian airspace. The cloud ceiling had lowered. The atmosphere above the Ukraine SSR had become a solid, impenetrable dome of ionization. They were trapped in the cage with the beast. By May, the concept of the Soviet Union as a political entity had ceased to matter. The geography of Eastern Europe was no longer defined by borders, but by the infection rate. The Red Army, the largest mechanized force the world had ever seen, dug its final trench line along the western banks of the Dnieper River. Kiev was abandoned, a necropolis of 2 million souls lost to the grey dust, a sentient, airborne spore that calcified the lungs and rewrote the brain. The bridges were blown, severing the east from the west, but the entity did not need bridges. It built them out of us. The Battle of the Dnieper was the last organized military engagement of the human race in the Eastern Hemisphere. General Yazov, commanding the remnants of the southern group of forces, authorized the deployment of the aerosolized defoliants and napalm reserves meant for World War III. For 3 days, the river burned. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, but from the smoke emerged the Titan's amalgamations of fused concrete, twisted rebar, and biological slurry, towering 30 meters high. They waded through the boiling river, shrugging off tank shells like rain. The TIT tanks, the apex of Soviet armor, fired point-blank into the advancing wall of flesh. It was futile. The shells detonated, but the flesh simply knit itself back together. Fueled by the ambient radiation that was now 5,000 times the lethal dose. In a bunker deep beneath Moscow, the Politburo stared at maps that were turning entirely black. The decision was made, the ultimate blasphemy against the land they swore to protect. Operation Sunscorch, a tactical nuclear strike. If the atom had started this, the atom would end it. A Tu-95 Bear bomber, stripped of its markings, roared over the wasteland that was once Ukraine. It deployed a 20-kiloton warhead directly over the epicenter of the zone, the sarcophagus of Unit 4. The detonation occurred at 12 p.m. on May 9th, Victory Day. The flash blinded the satellites of the West. The mushroom cloud rose, perfectly symmetrical, a monument to destruction. The generals waited for the thermal pulse to vaporize the biomass. They waited for the silence, but the silence never came. Instead of destroying the entity, the nuclear fire fed it. The radiation from the bomb acted as an adrenaline shot to the heart of the god. The mushroom cloud didn't dissipate. It solidified. The fallout didn't drift. It spread with predatory intent. The shockwave that hit Moscow an hour later was not air pressure. It was a psychic scream. Every radio, every television, every telephone in the USSR simultaneously broadcast a sound that was described by the few survivors as the laughter of burning children. The Kremlin fell not to invasion, but to madness. The guards at Lenin's mausoleum turned their rifles on the crowds before turning them on themselves. The stars atop the Kremlin towers flickered and went dark, their ruby glass shattered by the high-frequency resonance of the approaching storm. The chain of command evaporated, the silos went silent. The frantic calls from Washington and London went unanswered. The Iron Curtain had become a literal shroud, sealing off the East in a tomb of eternal radioactive night. Organized human resistance ended not with a treaty, but with a dial tone. It has been nearly 40 years since the transmission ceased. The Eurasian landmass is no longer designated on maps as political territory. It is simply marked in black, labeled by the United Nations remnant as the necrosis. Satellites passing over the Eastern Hemisphere capture images not of cities, but of vast calcified coral reefs made of bone and concrete, stretching from the ruins of Berlin to the Urals. The sky above Europe is a perpetual swirling bruise of violet and gray, a closed atmospheric system that recycles its own poison. There is no weather there, only the circulation of spores. In 2025, the surviving world is a fortress. The Americas, isolated by the grace of the Atlantic and Pacific, have become a dystopian quarantine state. We do not look up at the stars anymore. We watch the shorelines. The Atlantic Aegis, a continuously active naval blockade of drone ships and railguns, patrols the meridian, sinking anything that drifts from the east. We tell ourselves we are safe. We tell ourselves the salt water acts as a barrier, but the ocean is fluid. You cannot wall off the tide. Recent sonar analysis from the mid-Atlantic ridge detects massive biological movement in the deep trenches, leviathans of fused biomass moving in the dark, migrating west. The contamination has adapted, it has learned to swim. Samples taken from the coast of Newfoundland show the water is beginning to glow with a faint familiar Serenkov blue. The tragedy of Serenko was not that we played with fire. It was that we mistook the fire for a tool, when it was actually a hunger. The entity born in Unit 4 does not hate us. It simply wants to make us whole. It wants to merge our flesh with the steel, our breath with the steam, our souls with the background radiation. It is patient. It has consumed an empire, and now it looks across the water at the last flickering lights of the West. The Geiger counters on the Jersey shore have begun to click. The wind is changing, and in the silence of the night, if you listen closely to the static between radio stations, you can still hear them. The voices of 1986 calling out to us, inviting us to join them in the eternal warmth of the core. This is Thanatos. The simulation is concluded. To explore more timelines where humanity falters, subscribe and enter the archives. The reactor is waiting.